honored scholar. He is an expert in the field of the movement of geopolitical forces around the world, and historically, he has written extensively on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and he's kind enough to join us now. I'm envious because when I was an undergraduate at Princeton University, we were not so fortunate as the students at Columbia University are today to have someone like Professor Sachs on the faculty. Professor Sachs, thank you very much for joining us.
It is so good to be with you. I'm absolutely delighted.
Thank you. Can you, I'll let you lecture for a minute or two. Can you give us the basic background starting in 1990 when Germany, the United States, and Russia agreed that NATO would not move 1 inch further east? Take us to Minsk I and Minsk II, and take us to the coup in 2014, largely engineered and orchestrated by the American State Department.
Well, you've touched on all the main points that led to this war. I actually go back to the late 80s and early 90s because President Gorbachev asked me to help his economic team. President Yeltsin asked me to help his economic team. President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, asked me to help his economic team. So I've watched this close up. Look, it was very straightforward. Gorbachev was a man of peace. He said that the Soviet Union will end the Warsaw Pact military alliance, and the US and Germany were very explicit. This is James Baker, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany. We will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. Of course, it was a lie. It was a lie because as soon as the Soviet Union ended and Russia became the continuation state, or the successor state as it's sometimes called, the United States immediately within even Bush 1 was calculating, okay, how do we expand NATO? We won, they lost, we expand. Promises, commitments don't mean anything. And already our diplomats, the senior diplomats, Jack Matlock, U.S. ambassador to Russia, of course, George Kennan, perhaps the greatest historian scholar of our time and the original author of Containment in 1947, said this is a terrible idea. Don't break the peace with Russia right away. Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, Bill Perry at the time, said, don't do this. And he thought about resigning. But you know, Clinton, he didn't think very hard about it. The security state said, just move right on in. NATO expansion started. We know from Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 that the game plan was already clear, the timeline, to go all the way to Ukraine and further to Georgia. And if you look at a map, Georgia ain't a North Atlantic country by any means in the Caucasus.
Let me just stop you right here.
Sure.
You are not saying that Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush changed their minds. You are not saying that events caused them to rethink this. You are saying that they knowingly deceived Mikhail Gorbachev.
No, I'm not sure about that. What was clear in the Bush administration was a division between Baker, who was really a pretty pragmatic guy, I think a very effective guy in a lot of ways, and the hardliners, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Cheney, who would invent the neocon era, in fact. And so I'm not sure that they knowingly lied in 90. They were giddy, though. Giddy. My God, we are winning. We're going to take all the pieces. But it was really, it was really in 92. After the December end of the Soviet Union in 1991, I happened to be in the room when it happened, as they say. Actually, I was sitting in the room in the Kremlin when President Yeltsin walked across the room, sat down directly in front of me and said, gentlemen, to this assembly of economists, I can announce the end of the Soviet Union. It was a rather astounding moment. But then, as soon as that happened, I think Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld went into overdrive. It was a very strange last year of the Bush 1 administration. Clinton, I don't think ever knew what he was doing in foreign policy, probably until today, in my own opinion. But in any event, we changed immediately.
How does Ukraine enter this sordid history?
I think Ukraine enters from an old proposition going back to the Crimean War of the middle of the 19th century, which is if you can surround Russia in the Black Sea, you've really ended Russian power. And this was very clear to Zbigniew Brzezinski in his global chessboard of 1997. He said that Ukraine was the geographic pivot of Eurasia. And you look at a map. What was the idea? The idea was that U.S. military forces would be in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. And you look at the map, Sevastopol, the Russian base since 1783, is right there, and then it's cornered. And the Russians knew this, and they were saying from the early 90s, don't do this. And then when it started to become apparent that doing this meant not only Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, which they swallowed hard on, but those are Central European states after all, when they saw that this is NATO coming to their borders. And in 2007, that meant the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. It meant two Black Sea countries, Romania and Bulgaria, and it meant the Balkan states, Slovenia, and also Slovakia. They said in 2007, my God, don't do anything more. And that's when President Putin at the Munich Security Conference really laid it out very clearly. He said, look, you guys promised in 1991 not 1 inch eastward. All you're doing is threatening a new conflict. Stop. Well, I think the defining feature of American foreign policy is arrogance, and they can't listen. They cannot hear red lines of any other country. They don't believe they exist. The only red lines are American red lines.
Before we get to the impetus behind this arrogance in American foreign policy, and before you tell us about the harm caused by the neocons, bring us into 2004 and 2014 in Ukraine.
2004 was called the Orange Revolution. It was a contested election. The United States played a strong role in contesting the election, and American-funded Ukrainian so-called civil society institutions played a role, and the election was overturned, and the pro-U.S. candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, won a rerun of the election. And he called for NATO enlargement. But he lasted one term, and in the rerun of the competition between Yushchenko and Yanukovych, excuse me, and President Yanukovych won the next round very handily, by the way. And so Yanukovych came in 2010, 2011, 2012, saying, look, the U.S. in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit said NATO will enlarge to Ukraine. And Yanukovych said, no, please. We are in between. We will be neutral, thank you. It was extremely prudent. This is the key to understand. Prudence, careful. When you're on Russia's border, be careful. When you're in between the Western nuclear superpower, the Russian nuclear superpower, be careful. And Yanukovych tried to be careful. He really did try with skill to be careful. He knew the country was divided ethnically, divided about its beliefs about the future, divided economically. And so he tried to do things to tamp down this U.S. neocon push for NATO enlargement. One of the key things he did was to say to the Russians, look, you can have a long-term lease on your Sevastopol naval base. Yes, it has been your naval base since 1783, and we're not going to tamper with it. Very smart. He said, we will be neutral. This was a big majority backing him at the time.
And what happens to him What does the U.S. State Department do about this at or about 2014?
Well, at the end of 2013, things got very complicated because the Europeans were pushing hard for a roadmap to Ukrainian membership in the EU, which unfortunately has become completely entwined with membership in NATO.
Right.
And on the other hand, Ukraine was in financial crisis. The IMF was doing its usual twisting the knot as tight as possible. President Putin was saying, you can't make an agreement on free trade with Europe without including us. We are a free trade partner with you. We need to discuss this too. Yanukovych said, okay, we'll delay signing with the EU. Protests broke out and the US saw its moment. We can stoke these protests. Okay, John McCain will go over there. Lindsey Graham will go over there. Victoria Nuland will nonstop shuttle to Kiev. We can even, overthrow this government that is calling for neutrality. And it's pretty clear in early 2014 that regime change and a typical kind of U.S. covert regime change operation was underway. And I say typical because scholarly studies have shown that just during the Cold War period alone, there were 64 U.S. covert regime change operations. This is it's astounding. Serious scholarship has devoted its time to tracing all the times the U.S. overthrows or tries to overthrow other governments. Well, there's no doubt.
The U.S. overthrows Yanukovych. He's replaced by somebody sympathetic to the West.
Let me tell you, just to say, in this overthrow, and Victoria Nuland, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State for Obama, now is our Deputy Secretary of State. She was the point person in the U.S. engagement in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And in an incredible excerpted phone call, Russians probably were able to tap into the call between Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat. She described forming the new government, and she also described something absolutely remarkable, which is, okay, we're going to get the Veep, the big guy, Biden, to come in and do his attaboys and make everything work out well. And who was engaged with her on that? Jake Sullivan, who at the time was the vice president's national security advisor. So we've seen this team continuously operating since 2014. Biden's been absolutely part of this since then and before, because he always was pushing NATO enlargement. So what we had was a Russophobic government come in, a lot of right-wing elements, extreme nationalist elements come in. Immediately, Putin said, "You're not taking Crimea for a NATO naval base," and Putin organized that referendum in a completely Russian ethnic part of the region in Crimea, and said, "Now Crimea is part of Russia," and we know that two breakaway regions in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine were basically military parts of the Ukrainian army that did not want to succumb to a Russophobic regime now installed in Kiev.
Are those the parts of Ukraine, Professor Sachs, that the current regime in Kiev has been shelling and shooting at its own people?
Well, as soon as these breakaway republics broke away and taking some of the armaments with them to defend these new breakaway regions, which were demanding autonomy, by the way, that's what they were demanding. They were demanding the use of the Russian language, the Russian Orthodox Church, the relations with Russia, the family relations, the travel, the open borders, and so forth. The war began with essentially right-wing militaries like the Azov Battalion and so forth, the banderistas, pretty fascistic ideologies in some cases, attacking in the East. And a lot of people died. Thousands and thousands of people were being killed, civilians, ethnic Russian civilians
What
in the
era
Donbass.
is this? This is before February of 2022, is it not?
This already goes back to 2014 and 2015.
Well, you never saw this on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post.
You incidentally, in 2017, 2018, you saw a lot of stories that Ukraine has a Nazi problem, a lot of Nazi symbols, a lot of fascism. Those stories completely disappeared. But those stories are actually even searchable online, what they were saying back then. But the key point is the following. Russia said, stop killing ethnic Russian civilians. We need peace. And 2 agreements were negotiated. And the most important was the Minsk II agreement. And what the Minsk II agreement called for was autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk, for these 2 breakaway regions, not to become part of Russia, not to become an independent state.
Who agreed? Who agreed? What parties, what countries agreed to the Minsk II agreement, Professor Sachs?
The government of Ukraine, these 2 breakaway parts of Ukraine, which signed, and then guarantors of this agreement. And this is fascinating because in Europe, the 2 guarantors were Germany under then Chancellor Angela Merkel and France under President Hollande originally. And the whole agreement remarkably went to the UN Security Council, where it was also backed 15-0 in the UN Security Council. This was a serious agreement. It was never enforced by the Ukrainians. And I can tell you my own experience, knowing many senior Ukrainian officials. I said, look, you've got to honor the Minsk agreement. They said, no, we're never going to do that. That was done at gunpoint. I said, come on, you signed the agreement. The UN Security Council has endorsed the agreement. This is diplomacy. It's to keep the peace. We're never going to do it. And now we know that no Ukrainian leader had any intention of doing it. And then Angela Merkel, just a few months ago, gave a remarkable, very disappointing interview where she said, yes, we knew it wasn't really going to be agreed or followed, but it gave some time for the Ukrainians to build up their strength. We also can surmise, and again, since our government operates in as much secrecy as they can possibly get away with without whistleblowers and leaks, they absolutely told the Ukrainians, don't worry about a thing. We've got your back. You're going to join NATO. And then to bring it up to the present, when Biden came in, of course, no one knew exactly what this meant, but we could have known because Biden's been part of this story since the overthrow of Yanukovych, and he's been part of the NATO enlargement story for even longer than that, so we should have known. But some of us had some hope that there would be some rationality in this process, and Biden instead absolutely doubled down. Ukraine will be part of NATO. We will increase the armaments. The 2021 NATO summit enforced this again. The United States, in the first year of the Biden administration, signed 2 high-level agreements with the Ukrainian government, underscoring Ukraine's membership in NATO, one with the State Department, one with the Defense Department. Now, at the end of 2021, on December 17th, President Putin put forward a draft security agreement between Russia and the United States. I read it. I thought, you know what? Absolutely negotiable. Not everything is going to be accepted, but the core of this is NATO should stop the enlargement so we don't have a war. And I called the White House at the end of 2021 when somebody was still talking to me, and I had a long talk, and I said, avoid this war. This war is avoidable. You don't want a war on your watch. oh, no, 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 NATO doesn't mean anything. Blah, blah. I said, if NATO doesn't mean anything, announce it's not going to happen. No, no, we have an open door policy. I said, that's no policy. That's a path to war. And you know it. You've got to negotiate. Click. So that phone call, as so many in my career, didn't do anything except to tell me, my God, these people do not understand anything about diplomacy, anything about reality. Their own diplomats have been telling them for 30 years, this is a path to war. Our current CIA director, William Burns, very bright chap, sent a famous message to Condoleezza Rice in 2008. Of course, we know about it only because of WikiLeaks. Everything is secret in our society. Everything is lies, by the way, in our society, except when things are leaked. But the memo was famously entitled, Niet means Niet. Don't do this NATO thing with Ukraine of all the neuralgic points you could possibly do in your diplomacy. Well, the Biden people couldn't listen because Newland and Blinken and Sullivan and Biden have been in it up to their necks since 2014, completely irresponsibly, in my view. And on February 21st, 2022, there's an extraordinary Russian Security Council meeting. It's extraordinary because we can read online the minutes of the meeting. And President Putin calls on the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, please report on your negotiations over our proposed security arrangements. And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we have failed entirely because the United States has declared unequivocally that NATO enlargement is not our business and that there is nothing to discuss about it. And of course, Putin gave his address to the nation and explained that Russian national security was at deep risk, and the special military operation started February 24. Now, what's absolutely interesting in all of this is that within a few days, Zelensky starts saying publicly, you know, we could be neutral. You know, we don't really have to be part of NATO. This starts within a few days. This was the essence of what Russia was trying to do, not to conquer Kiev. It was trying to push a settlement of this security issue. And Zelensky said,
was there a reduced to writing but never ratified settlement in March of 2022?
There indeed was. And I have had the chance to speak with several very, very senior people that were involved in this. And one thing that's extremely interesting, when Zelensky made his statements, President Putin said to his top aides, well, okay, see what this is about. And Ukraine actually put something on paper as a first draft, and the Russian leadership looked at it, sent it on to Putin, and President Putin said, okay, draft an agreement, draft a draft agreement. They were actually negotiating, and they were negotiating in Ankara under a very skilled diplomatic corps of Turkey.
Is this the negotiation with the then Prime Minister of Israel as well as diplomats from Turkey?
Yes.
Let me guess who disrupted this agreement. The U.S. State Department.
Naftali Bennett is hilarious, by the way, because you don't see prime ministers talking this way. He gave a 5-hour interview where he explained his life. He told us lots of fascinating things. And one of the things he explained to us was how interesting it was. He suddenly found himself as intermediary of Putin and Zelensky and Biden and Schultz. And yeah, it was very exciting. And they were working on the 7th draft, and they were making progress. They were coming close to signing. And then Naftali Bennett explains in this wonderful interview, quite remarkable, he says, they stopped it. They stopped it. He says the Americans stopped it. And he actually explains, by the way, they stopped it because they wanted to look tough to China. They were worried that this could look weak to China. So it's not even a proxy war with Russia. It's all about China in this crazy, crazy, topsy-turvy, weird failure of diplomacy. And then, of course, after Bennett says this and everyone's shocked, he walks it back. No, I didn't say that. I didn't mean it. Because that's the other way that our world works, is when a little bit of truth leaks out, you deny it, even though it's in front of your eyes, even though you could play the tapes again and again. So the United States stopped the diplomacy, and Ukraine has been the victim. And I would say, of course, its leadership doesn't represent the interests of the Ukrainian people, in my view, at all, because this has been a bloodbath since then, a tragic, predictable bloodbath. And all of the shows you've had, Judge, with Scott Ritter and with Douglas McGregor have explained all along why this is going to be a bloodbath. I know the economic side, that the sanctions weren't going to work. I understood the diplomatic side. I didn't know the military side. But this has been a predictable bloodbath, and the Americans have known it. And even this vaunted counteroffensive of the last 3 months, they knew this wasn't going to work. But, Biden, he's running for re-election. Zelensky, he's dug into this. So we have this terrible, terrible phenomenon of the interests of the world being staked on the interests of a few politicians. This is completely upside down.
Wow. What an extraordinary, remarkable, gifted, no notes in your hands lecture on all of this. Where do you see this going? I mean, Victoria Nuland and the neocons who have brought us to this precipice are not going to back down. In my view, they want to use Ukraine as a battering ram for their fanciful view that it can drive President Putin from office.
Everything can still happen except that, I'm pretty sure, in terms of what will happen on the battlefield. It could be that after the exhaustion of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is exhausted and which has claimed tens of thousands of deaths and so many wounded and massive destruction of the military equipment, the miracle weapon shipped over, could be that Russia launches a major offensive and changes completely the situation. This is one possibility. Another possibility is that this grinding, continuing, bloody, horrible war continues because a few politicians don't want to admit how wrong-headed, predictably wrong-headed this whole thing is. There's always the chance also that these completely intemperate and irresponsible people in our government aim to escalate because maybe the situation turns down and they say, oh, this is bad for Biden's reelection, as if we should care. Our politicians work for us. We don't work for them. I never care about a politician's reelection. I care about what they are doing. But if they decide to escalate, we're talking about the world's two largest nuclear superpowers, and never we should put that out of our minds. We shouldn't. We're told, oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But, I've been studying this issue also for decades. We should always worry about what intemperate people in dangerous circumstances can do, how accidents can happen, how we can lose control of events. It's all terribly dangerous. We need a completely new approach to all of this, predictably so, because you could have known back in 1990 or in 1997 or in 2007 or in 2008 or in 2014 or in 2021 or in 2022. This was a huge, huge blunder of Biden. We need a new approach. Frankly, he needs a new he needs a new foreign policy team. This foreign policy team is so dug in. Of course, he's dug into it too, but he's the president, right. So he needs to hire a new team that knows how to get out of this absolutely catastrophic mess.
Professor Sachs, I'm in awe of your knowledge of this. I usually speak a lot more during the show, but far be it from me to interrupt you. We'll call it quits now, but I hope you can come back because I'd like to ask you some more questions. This
anytime.
Professor, this has been a brilliant, gifted analysis, consistent with what this program has stood for. consistent with the military side of this from Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter, consistent with the intelligence side of this.
I thought, oh, this is a miracle. Here I am sitting in the Kremlin. This was not a Cold War normal period, but I saw that Cold War thinking remained very strong on the American side. I think it remains strong until today. I bemoan that. I started working with Gorbachev, who was so innovative. It was basically, he reimagined the whole world in ways that few people understood or agreed with on his side or on our side. But he thought, what are we doing? We share a common geography in Eurasia. We need to have peace. So Gorbachev said, we're going to have massive political reform. Of course, when you're coming out of a repressive system, all hell can break loose, and it did in certain ways, in certain places, war and huge disputes. But I thought, oh my God, this is a chance for real cooperation. My main point in the early 1990s was the United States should help make the transformation of the Soviet Union or of Russia to a democratic and more open and more market-based economic system. But basically what I said fell on deaf ears, mostly in the United States, not so much in Russia. Russia was kind of open to, well, if that's the right way to go. But in the United States, help them? Are you kidding? That was the view. And I regard that basically as the underlying deep source of our problems since then. We just want to be in control. The United States, it's a kind of mentality that goes way back. It's the American exceptionalism. It is the deep belief of many Americans and also at the top of the system that the world is only safe if America runs the show. And I don't see things that way. My view is other people don't want to be run by outsiders. They want to run their own affairs, but in a cooperative way. And therein lies the tensions. Every day to now with this war, we still hear U.S. leader of the free world, U.S. leader of the West, U.S. leader of NATO. It's this leadership thing. And of course, many Americans say, Sachs, are you crazy? Of course, that's the way. I just don't have that view.
Well, in April, the Leadership Council of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network issued a statement asking the United Nations to do more to end the Russian war in Ukraine. Why did you feel like the UN wasn't doing enough to help bring an end to this war?
Well, the UN means two things, first of all. It means its member states. That's 193 countries. And then there is the UN system of organizations and agencies and so forth. The real political base of the UN is its members. And in two senses, there's the General Assembly, which includes all countries, one country, one vote. And then there's the Security Council. The Security Council is where war and peace issues are supposed to be addressed. There are 5 permanent members of the Security Council, each with a veto: the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, and then 10 rotating countries for a total of 15. So when we say the UN should do more, the answer to my mind is yes, but that means several different things. It means the member states, it means the UN Security Council, it means the leadership of the UN, it means the UN agencies. The UN was established to end the scourge of war. Obviously, it can't do that by itself, and it doesn't do that by itself, but it is the core purpose. It was invented by our greatest president in the United States in our history, Franklin Roosevelt, for the purpose of surmounting the underlying reasons for World War II and World War I, the geopolitics, the arms races, the lack of global rule of law. And so ending wars, making peace is the core business. I'm in another part of the UN activities, which is economic development, and that's important. And also the human rights side is important, but the core of the UN is about peace. And I think the UN till today is not doing enough in all of those contexts to end this war. Now, what we hear from the rhetoric in our mainstream media in the United States is, well, Putin is a Hitler, and he has to be stopped, and we have to defeat him. And it's as simple as that. And there's no talking to him. The man is crazed, living in a dream world of Russian imperialism. There's no stopping him. Any agreement is to rip up a piece of paper. I can tell you, since I'm an old guy now, 67, I've lived through this characterization. Every decade, there's a new Hitler that we can't deal with, whether it was Ho Chi Minh or whether it was Vietnam or whether it was Cambodia or Laos or Nicaragua, for heaven's sake, or Iraq or Syria. We are real good at this game of rhetoric, but this is not real. And since I am all over the world, virtually all the time, speaking with world leaders, what we hear in our media is propaganda. It is not real. We should be negotiating. Actually, Biden refused to negotiate with Putin in 2021 because Putin raised a very specific set of points. One was NATO enlargement. And then there's a chorus here that says, oh, that's a phony issue. That's a red herring. That's fake. That's not fake. I've been in this issue since 1990, when the West promised Gorbachev no NATO enlargement. We're liars. I'm sorry to put it that way. We cheated. We continue to do this. And then Biden refused to negotiate. Okay, that's straightforward, except it's not the way the story is told. Then there is the question of Ukraine itself, which is an ethnically divided country because there is a significant Russian minority. And those are real issues, by the way, although war is not an answer to them in any sense. But there was a very complicated, very difficult conflict where the U.S. was stirring the pot also back in a decade ago, and especially around 2014 and 2015. And there were actually agreements reached for the area where the fighting is raging right now, for the Donbas region. And the agreements were called the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. They were signed by the Ukraine government. And then the government said, no, we don't want to do those. And when Putin says, well, what about the Minsk agreements? He is shouted down or ignored. No, they don't exist. They were unfair. They were this, they were that. They were actually agreements. When I say this, I can only tell you how many emails I'm going to get from Ukrainian Canadians, Ukrainian Americans. Sachs, are you crazy? What are you saying? But the truth is, diplomacy is crucial if you're going to avoid wars. Signing agreements matters. You can't just walk away from them. That's true of Russia, I'm the first to say. It's true of Ukraine also. It's true of the United States also. And so we actually should be sitting down and negotiating. And all of our media don't discuss substance of what this war is really about, or what its roots are, or even what the claims of Putin are. Just say repeatedly, he's Hitler, he's a madman, He's out of control. There's nothing to do but defeat him. That's our mantra. That kind of mantra can get us all killed if we go down this road, because it's false and it's extraordinarily dangerous. Because, like it or not, we don't like it, but Russia has 1,600 active nuclear warheads, and we don't even want to sit down to talk. And shame on our government not to have diplomacy with Russia. At least sit, talk, discuss, and explain. We don't do that. We just say victory, victory, victory on the battlefield. Well, I'm not in it for that, because this is a very dangerous and very unwise approach.
It's incredibly destructive, and escalating this crisis is, as you mentioned, it only gets scarier, more damaging, and more destructive from there. So what would an outcome, a reasonable outcome, be from your perspective? What, if you're President Zelensky, what would you accept to get to a peaceful resolution to what's going on now?
This agreement was actually on the table back in the end of March, and then Ukraine walked away from it, from what I understand, because the U.S. told them walk away from it. We're providing the weapons, and the U.S. and even more the U.K., which is a more experienced empire than the U.S. and has a mindset, even though it's the empire is long gone, but they still have a imperial mindset that is even more imperial than our mindset. They said to the Ukrainians, don't negotiate. You don't have to. Just beat them on the field. So what was on the table at the end of March was basically neutrality for Ukraine, so that NATO and Russia wouldn't be right up against the border with each other, which is incredibly dangerous. Because if you have the two forces right up against each other, you are in a tripwire of nuclear war. We should have a zone where we're apart, where there's some time to talk, some time to work out problems for deconfliction. But no, we wanted to be right up against the border. But what Zelensky said back in the end of March was neutrality. Neutrality with guarantees. Okay, that's a very valid issue. How is that neutrality going to be protected? But that was point one. Point two was something on the Donbass. Even I said, okay, Minsk 1, Minsk 2 were signed. You can't just walk away from those agreements. You have to do something about them. The third, which is everybody, by the way, on the inside acknowledges there's no answer, is Crimea. Because Crimea is a really weird story of Russia's seaport on the Black Sea, its naval base in Sverdlovsk. So fundamental for Russian security. But Khrushchev in 1954, of course, in what was then a completely symbolic gesture, when the Soviet Union had administrative lines that were within an overall state. He said, okay, we gift Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. It didn't mean anything when there was a Soviet army and Soviet naval base and all the rest. But after 1991, it certainly meant something. And what happened in 2014 was the pro-Russian president was overthrown. Russia views that as a U.S. instigated coup. There is something to that, I know, actually. But again, this is one of those things that the Western media simply will not discuss. And it's so deeply hidden in classified documents that maybe in 50 years, someone will write a good book about Ukraine 2014 if we get to 50 years from now. But in 2014, the Russian President Yanukovych was overthrown. And at that moment, Putin seized Crimea. And there was a referendum, hard to know much about it, but Crimea became part of Russia. Okay. just to say 3 issues on the table: neutrality, the Donbass, and Crimea. And Crimea, the basic answer was, oh my God, okay, we continue to negotiate. It's a frozen conflict. The Donbass, something like the Minsk agreements, and neutrality. And then the government of Ukraine walked away from this, even after reports that there was close to an agreement. Then we have our defense secretary and our State Department, which used to be diplomats, but now it's warriors, saying we're going to defeat Russia. And so everything went away about the negotiations. So that's the long-winded answer to your question, that we weren't so far from actually having a negotiated outcome. And then Ukraine walked away, I think, under the instigation of the United States.
You know, the reason Ty and I have been such long admirers of your work and your writing is this focus on internationalism and cooperation, global cooperation, which, as a show about climate change, we obviously know that global cooperation is essential to decarbonize on any kind of sustainable timeline to limit warming at 1.5 or under 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels as outlined in the Paris Agreement. How do you think this war could have ripple effects beyond just the conflict we're seeing now? Do you think that this potentially could fundamentally reshape global politics in a way that could impact how we decarbonize around the globe?
What we're experiencing right now is a great power confrontation. So it's not merely in quotation marks, a Russian war in Ukraine or Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is a US-Russia confrontation. But what's striking is that the US is engaged in 2 fronts, one with Russia, the other with China. And we're seeing a lot of belligerency by the United States towards China in recent years as well. This started around 2014, roughly actually the time of those events in Ukraine, but really for somewhat different reasons, but are also escalating. And today there's news reports that I find, if it weren't so deadly and dangerous, I'd find it satirical. It's stories in the mainstream media saying, don't worry, the Ukraine war is not going to divert American attention from China. In other words, we're still going to have an antagonistic view to China. We're still going to make alliances in Asia. Don't worry. And this is explaining that we can do both. We can confront Russia. We can confront China. And I'm saying, oh my God, is this for real? Do we really want World War III? Is this our death wish? Is this our insanity? Is this our craziness of our exceptionalism? But there is this feeling we're in a feeling in the US, and they're trying to talk NATO into opening an Asia mission. In fact, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has said in the past year that NATO is going to direct its attention to China. Now, all of this is incredibly important for climate because China is essential for global climate policy, for cooperation, for every dimension of the climate crisis. China by itself can wreck the global climate because it emits about 28% of the greenhouse gases, in the United States about 14%. But just remember, since they're 4 times larger than we are in population, our per capita impact is much, much larger. But China better get this under control or we have a disaster. So are we sitting down to talk with China about this? Are we working out common systems? Are we working out technology standards? Are we agreeing to co-finance projects for decarbonization around the world? Well, I think you could probably guess the answer is no to all of those. We are changing the rhetoric regarding Taiwan. We are drumming up a drumbeat on Taiwan whenever, in the rare moments when U.S. so-called diplomats, but I don't find them very diplomatic, meet with Chinese counterparts, almost the first word out of their mouth is Taiwan, because what they want to do is, I don't know why, but they want to annoy and provoke China, and probably, and it could not be more dangerous, encourage Taiwan into some kind of adventure that would be incredibly dangerous for Taiwan. I admire Taiwan enormously. And because of that, I would keep the temperature down so that there is no tension, rather than raising the temperature, which I think can only hurt every dimension of this. Now, I was just speaking with the specialized funds around the world, addressing some of the core sustainable development issues, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and so forth. And what they're saying is the war in Ukraine is causing donors to say, you know what, we promised you, we can't really deliver, so we're going to be late. You have to understand, we have a rising military budget. We have a crisis, refugees. Well, this is what war does. War crowds out, even, I mean, literally survival, but it crowds out any kind of longer term thinking. And climate requires 30 years of investment in a concerted way, in a cooperative manner, in a trans-border manner. You don't decarbonize on a whim. You have to make plans. You have to invest in new power systems, power generation, transmission systems, grids that take 10, 15, 20 years to bring to fruition. So all of this makes the climate agenda fraught. And also in the short term, of course, it's bizarre. You have the Biden administration, which came into office as a climate champion, trying to raise production of fossil fuels and say, go for it, because we have to offset the production that we're trying to keep from being exported from Russia. So politically, you turn on the spigot again, rather than saying, no, you should be phasing out and phasing in something else. We say, go for it. Go for the coal, oil, and gas, because that will defeat Russia. And this is, these politicians are really going to be the end of us unless we are able to get a politics that really works for our well-being, not a politics that works for their incredibly short-run horizons.
Yeah, there have been many calls in Europe and elsewhere to speed up the transition to renewable energy as a result of this war. I know you've been skeptical in other interviews that this war will actually inspire that kind of necessary action. I mean, how has the decision to end Russian fossil fuel imports impacted the clean energy transition here and abroad?
I would say again that the first thing is it just distracts, because if you want to make a transition, you need clear long-term thinking. Clear long-term thinking, at least for me, requires some quiet. Okay, we need to think through 10 years, 20 years. What are we going to do? But with war, it's day to day. It's improvisation. It's budgets that are shifted for armaments. And in a very practical way, it's reopening coal mines, reopening fracking, reopening gas fields, because you scramble in the short term when energy prices soar, which they have soared in recent weeks. And with sudden cutoffs of Russian gas, well, now Europe is taking whatever actions it can to keep the lights on, to keep the air conditioning on this summer, and so forth. And that means that we're not in a long-term planning mode. You could say, and there is a certain sense, well, Russia shouldn't be exporting fossil fuels for the long term. So all of this is in the direction of long-term change. And indeed, I said to Russian friends and the Russian government for years, of course you have to decarbonize. There cannot be a petro state in 2050. There can be a solar state, there can be wind power, hydropower, hydrogen economy, but there cannot be a petro state. And in a way, yes, this points in that direction. But the problem is that the transformations that we need require organization, planning, and long-term finance, and war works against all of that.
I want to switch topics quickly here because I'd love to get your thoughts on the inflation that America is facing today. How will passing parts of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, especially the parts related to investing in the clean energy transition, impact inflation?
You know, the basic point with inflation is that we have a holy mess that's come together to put us back into what's called stagflation. Higher prices, rising prices at a rapid pace, combined with an economy which is strong at the moment, but is absolutely going to slow down, maybe even have a hard landing. And worldwide, we'll have more inflation and even another downturn. Europe probably is already in a downturn because of the war hitting Europe even harder. Well, I came into economics actually 42 years ago when I joined the faculty at Harvard University. My first book was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation. It was studying this kind of phenomenon. The 1970s was a period of war. The Yom Kippur War in Israel against its Arab neighbors, for example, the Arab oil embargo, which is not so different from what's happening now, a breakdown of monetary arrangements, which were then called the Bretton Woods system, because it was under the IMF that the US dollar played a particular role in international monetary affairs. So there was this incredible confluence of monetary, fiscal, geopolitical, and resource shocks that came together and produced a stagflation, which was worth writing a book about. So here we are again. We are in a stagflationary mode. Interestingly, the Federal Reserve really had pumped up the money supply for many, many years. And especially after COVID hit. In fact, in two phases, one after the 2008 great crunch, the financial crisis, and then again in 2020, even more remarkably in certain ways, the Fed pumped in money and nothing really happened on inflation except Bitcoin prices went up or stock market prices went up or some asset value prices went up. But prices in the street didn't seem to go up very much. And so there was the modern monetary theory. Oh, we could just print money to our heart's content. And as a monetary economist, I was scratching my head, frankly, saying, how could the money supply go up so much and not have inflation? Well, there is some mystery to that. There remains in disentangling all of this. But I would say the following. We've had a huge increase of the money supply by the Fed. We've had two huge supply shocks, COVID and the war. And the result now is that we are in an inflationary period that is painful and that is familiar in certain ways, more familiar perhaps than how macro looked 2 or 3 years ago. And what does all of this mean? It means, first of all, the world economy is unstable. That goes along with the war also. That goes along with the sanctions regime. That goes along with geopolitical tension. I don't like any of it because it makes everything much harder and it really hits poor countries very, very hard. So we're going to have a lot of debt crises coming up if we don't decisively take measures to head those off. Second, the inflation's likely to continue for a while because the underlying factors are not going to go away. Third, we need to sort out the basics. For me, the first basic is end this war. Second basic is end the taunting and the provocations of China, and some specific measures like the Trump tariffs that were put on Chinese goods that raised prices, by the way, but also created a trade war. Third, I've said now, I can't tell you how many decades, if we want to fund things to make our society decent, we have to raise taxes. You can't do it by printing money, and you can't do it just by debt. So this is a third point that becomes quite important. All really important good things, like decarbonizing the energy system, are affordable by definition. We can't afford not to do them. We will completely wreck the planet. In fact, decarbonizing the energy system requires perhaps a percentage point, even arguably a little bit more than that, per year of GDP in incremental outlays. Maybe, okay, it could be even more than that on some accounts. That's absolutely affordable. But we should have a tax system that is compatible with our spending needs. There's a lot of saving, by the way, that we should be doing in this country. I testified in Congress recently on the fact that our healthcare costs are roughly twice what they should be. We spend 2 times more than our peer countries on hospitalization days, on procedures, on medicines and so forth, because we have a quite monopolized, privately owned healthcare system in this country, which has a lot of market power to jack up prices. All of this is to say the Build Back Better agenda is right, because those are about long-term structural changes. I argued, good, it's right, raise taxes to pay for them. That's the right way to do this. Whether we see another major piece of legislation in this country for years to come, I think is quite doubtful right now. I doubt that the Democrats